There is a silence that screams louder than any argument. And that's when the empath finally understands they were never truly safe. Not with the people they loved most. Not even with the ones they bent over backwards to protect. The revelation doesn't come during the chaos. It arrives after, in the eerie calm that settles like dust in a long-abandoned room. The fights are over, the shouting stopped, but the unease remains. And that's the moment that breaks them, when they realize their body still flinches at kindness, that even peace feels suspicious. Why? Because for so long, they built their identity around soothing the very storms that scared them. They stayed. They always stayed. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." For the empath, this unconscious programming is often buried so deep it feels like instinct. But it isn't instinct, it's survival conditioning. The need to belong, to be loved, to matter, was twisted around unsafe people who only valued the empath when they were useful, calm, or forgiving. So the empath kept showing up, defending them, explaining away red flags, making themselves smaller, softer, quieter. And each time they did, a part of them disappeared. Not because someone took it, but because they gave it away, hoping it would buy them safety. Take Jonah, for example, a thoughtful man in his late 30s. At work, he was the glue of every team, empathetic, understanding, the one who smoothed over tension. But at home, with his partner Devin, things were different. Devin was unpredictable, sometimes sweet, sometimes cruel. When Devin lashed out, Jonah rationalized it as stress. When Devin withdrew, Jonah leaned in harder. He told himself, "I just need to love better." His therapist once asked, "Why do you think you need to earn being treated well?" Jonah blinked. He'd never considered that. In childhood, Jonah's father praised him only when he made himself useful. That belief followed him into adulthood. If he was kind enough, calm enough, quiet enough, maybe love would feel safe. But it never did, and still he stayed. This is the haunting truth for many empaths. What they think is loyalty is actually repetition. What feels like love is often trauma with a new face. And what feels like fate, it's an old emotional wound guiding every step. Jung taught that the psyche seeks wholeness through repetition. It repeats what's unresolved, not to punish, but to reveal. And so, the empath unconsciously returns to the same emotional environment, hoping this time it will end differently. But unless the unconscious becomes conscious, it won't. They won't leave, not because they're weak, but because the part of them that longs for healing is still trying to find it in the wrong place. There's dramatic irony in the empath's story. The very trait that makes them beautiful, their compassion, is often the one weaponized against them. They believe they're helping. They believe their love can transform chaos. But what they're actually doing is ignoring the chaos inside them, the voice that whispers, "This isn't safe." That voice gets quieter each time it's ignored, until silence becomes normal, and normal becomes a prison. Why do they stay? Because the pain is familiar. Because freedom feels uncertain. Because there's a part of them, an inner child, a silent shadow, that fears if they stop trying, they'll be unlovable. That voice tells them, "You can't walk away now. They need you." But the truth is, they've mistaken their own wounding for someone else's redemption arc. And that is not healing. That's self-abandonment dressed as devotion. Carl Jung's shadow theory reminds us, what we repress controls us. And for empaths, the repression isn't anger or cruelty, it's boundaries. It's self-worth. It's the right to leave a room that doesn't feel safe. They tell themselves, "I'm not like them." But healing isn't about comparison. It's about wholeness. And no one becomes whole by bleeding for those who never stop cutting. So the door remains open, not because they can't close it, but because part of them still believes they must wait. Wait for permission. Wait for someone to change. Wait to be loved enough to matter. And yet, the deepest healing doesn't come when someone finally sees their worth. It comes when they stop waiting to be chosen and choose themselves instead. We don't fear what hurts us. We fear what we don't understand. There's a silent performance many empaths don't even know they're putting on until one day they can't remember who they were before the applause. From a young age, if you're highly sensitive, you start to notice everything. The sigh behind a smile, the tension in a room before a word is spoken, the sharp edge in a parent's tone before discipline falls. And so, your survival becomes a performance. You start to adjust, tone down your voice, hide your tears, smooth out your needs, because safety means being easy to love. You start becoming what others want, until the act becomes your identity. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we develop to meet the expectations of society. But for empaths, it's more than a social adaptation. It becomes emotional armor. You wear the smile like a shield. You rehearse apologies before you've made mistakes. You sense emotional shifts with the precision of a radar tower, always bracing for impact. The persona doesn't just protect you, it becomes you. But here's the tragedy. A mask can protect your face, but it can't protect your soul. And over time, the mask doesn't just cover your truth, it suffocates it. Consider a man named Elijah, a brilliant team leader known for his composure. Always calm in meetings, always defusing tension, always the reasonable one. But inside, he was unraveling. His manager, Darren, regularly dismissed his ideas in front of clients. A colleague took credit for his work 3 months in a row. Elijah felt his throat tighten before every Monday meeting, but he said nothing. Stay professional, he told himself. Don't rock the boat. That was the persona speaking, the part of him that had learned long ago that being likable was safer than being honest. He didn't want conflict. He wanted to be needed. He wanted to belong. And so, even as the disrespect grew louder, Elijah's voice grew quieter. Here's the irony. The persona doesn't just shield you from rejection, it shields others from your truth. Because if you told them how their actions actually made you feel, they might have to face themselves. And most people will avoid that at all costs. So they praise your patience, admire your grace under pressure, and never ask why you look tired all the time. They don't realize your kindness is coming from survival, not ease. They don't realize your smile is a mask stitched together by fear and obligation. Jung wrote, "The persona is a system of behavior that is imposed on the individual by necessity, in order to adapt to society's expectations. But what happens when that system begins to fail you? You'll feel it before you name it. The fatigue, the dread, the subtle resentment toward people you swore you loved. You'll sit in rooms where you used to feel important, and suddenly you'll feel invisible. You'll answer questions no one asked, and ask questions no one answers. You'll laugh in conversations that don't feel funny. And beneath it all, a quiet question will begin to whisper inside you. Why do I have to disappear to be loved here? The answer lies in your conditioning. Somewhere along the line, you confuse being good with being silent, being kind with being invisible. You believe that if you just kept performing, eventually someone would see the real you. But how could they? The mask was doing all the talking. And so, you stay in relationships where you feel anxious. You stay in jobs where your creativity is drained. You sit at dinner tables with people who haven't asked how you're doing in years. Because walking away feels like betrayal. But the truth is, staying is betrayal too, just not of them. Of yourself. The persona was once your protection. But now, it's your prison. Because every time someone makes you feel unsafe, the mask tightens. It whispers, be better. Try harder. Make them see your worth. But they don't. And they won't. Because the mask doesn't just protect you, it protects them too. It allows them to benefit from your presence without ever being held accountable for the damage they cause. Jung warned that the persona, when over-identified with, becomes a substitute for the self. And if you never remove it, you forget what your real face looks like. You forget what you sound like when you're not editing your truth for someone else's comfort. You forget that you were never meant to be everyone's peacekeeper. You were meant to be whole. The persona saved you once. But now, it's the reason you can't breathe in rooms you've outgrown. And unless you learn to take it off, your suffering will look polite, but feel unbearable. The mask you wear to survive often becomes the reason you keep suffering. There's a kind of suffering that doesn't scream, it simmers. It sits quietly behind someone's eyes, in their silence, in the way they hesitate before speaking. This is the pain of an empath who has stayed too long in a place they never felt safe. They're not angry on the surface. They smile. They offer help. They say it's fine when it's not. But inside, something is unraveling. This is what Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of us we repress in order to survive. And for the empath, the shadow isn't violent or hostile. It's the boundary that was never allowed. It's the scream that never escaped. It's the part of them that wants to say, "This is hurting me," but was trained to whisper, "I understand." Jung believed the shadow is everything we refuse to see about ourselves. But it doesn't stay buried. It leaks. It shows up in exhaustion that sleep can't fix, in resentment disguised as patience, in smiles that twitch at the corners when no one's looking. Repression isn't peace, it's a ticking clock. And when that time runs out, the consequences aren't loud, they're quiet, numbing, passive, desperate. Imagine a man named Eli, a school counselor, warm, attentive, always the one others came to for advice. His partner, Damon, was the opposite, moody, dismissive, emotionally distant. When Damon shut down during arguments, Eli reached in further. When Damon criticized, Eli apologized. He wore his empathy like armor, believing if he just stayed kind enough, patient enough, Damon would finally soften. Years passed. Friends admired Eli's gentle strength, never realizing that strength was built on self-abandonment. Eli's shadow didn't erupt, it faded. He started skipping meals, laughing less, feeling like a ghost in his own home. The shadow didn't scream. It starved him slowly. One evening, Eli sat in silence as Damon mocked him during a dinner with friends. Eli smiled, nodded, said nothing. But later, alone, he stared at his reflection for a long time. He didn't recognize the man in the mirror. "You don't belong here," the voice inside whispered. But the next morning, Eli made breakfast. Smiled again. This is the tragedy of shadow possession. You lose your ability to leave, not because someone is chaining you down, but because your shadow has been chained in your silence for so long, it no longer believes escape is allowed. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For empaths, this unconscious voice is the one they were never allowed to use. It's the no they swallowed, the anger they mistook for failure, the boundaries they were told were selfish. They think they're choosing to stay, but it's not a choice, it's a wound reenacting its script. The danger is this: the longer you suppress your shadow, the more it begins to express itself in self-sabotage. You procrastinate, you isolate, you stop creating, connecting, dreaming. Your energy revolts. Your nervous system, once hyper-attuned to others' emotions, goes numb. You're not healing, you're disappearing. The empath who protects everyone often has no protection left for themselves. And when they finally begin to feel angry, they panic. "I'm becoming just like them," they think. But anger isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The shadow's purpose isn't to destroy, it's to defend. It's the part of you that knows what doesn't feel right, what hurts, what you deserve but haven't received. When you reclaim it, you don't become cold, you become whole. And yet, many empaths don't. They tighten the mask. They stay longer. They tell themselves it's loyalty, but it's fear in disguise. Fear of being alone. Fear of being too much. Fear of becoming the thing they escaped. But here's the truth. You can't escape what lives in your unconscious. You can only integrate it. You must stop calling your collapse compassion. You must stop calling your silence love. And so the shadow waits. It waits in the body that aches without reason, in the sighs between conversations, in the nights where you stare at the ceiling wondering why you feel empty around people who claim to love you. The shadow doesn't want revenge. It wants you to come home. Comment if you've ever noticed this in someone you know. Because if you've ever watched someone shrink in a room they built, you're witnessing a shadow begging to speak. Sometimes we don't break the pattern. We just get tired of pretending we're okay in it. Sometimes the most dangerous prison has no bars, just a story you keep telling yourself. And for many empaths, that story sounds noble. I stayed because they were hurting. I stayed because I saw the good in them. I stayed because I love them. But look closer. Love isn't supposed to cost you your peace, your sleep, your voice. And yet, for someone like Ezra, it did. Ezra was the man everyone leaned on. Steady, calm, always the first to say it's okay. His girlfriend, Mara, was a storm in disguise, sometimes warm, often cold, always unpredictable. One day, she'd be playful and kind. The next, she'd go silent for hours, then erupt over something as small as a forgotten message. Ezra stayed, not because he was weak, but because he was wired to soothe chaos before it consumed him. He told himself, she's just healing, and wore that as armor against his growing doubts. But what he didn't realize was that his so-called patience was actually an old wound playing dress-up, a wound that whispered, if you leave, you're the bad guy. So he stayed, through the yelling, through the silence, through the emotional whiplash that left him questioning his own memory. He began to anticipate her moods before she did. He filtered every sentence to avoid setting her off. And slowly, quietly, he disappeared. Carl Jung once wrote, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And Ezra? He hadn't accepted that his identity had become tied to being needed, but never truly seen. His compassion had morphed into self-erasure. He wasn't in love with Mara. He was addicted to being her emotional regulator, her mirror, her apology sponge. This isn't uncommon. Empaths, especially those shaped by early emotional neglect, often believe that love means endurance, that walking away is betrayal. But here's the truth. Sometimes staying isn't love, it's fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being seen as unkind. Fear of facing the part of yourself that still thinks you only matter when you're fixing someone else. And here's the kicker. Ezra wasn't staying for Mara. He was staying for the boy he once was, the one who learned early that love had to be earned through suffering, that being the bigger person meant staying silent when hurt, that loyalty meant disappearing for the sake of peace. There's dramatic irony here too, because the very thing Ezra feared, being seen as heartless, was already happening in reverse. Mara never saw how much he bled to keep the peace, never saw the war he waged inside just to make her feel okay. And in doing so, Ezra became invisible, even to himself. When you wear a mask long enough, it starts to suffocate you. Jung called this the persona, the identity we build to survive in hostile emotional environments. Ezra's persona was the calm one, the understanding man, the emotional safe haven. But it was a role, not a life. And roles, no matter how noble, eventually collapse under the weight of your repressed truth. So what does this teach us? That not every kind act is kindness. That not every I'm here for you is love. Sometimes it's survival, a trauma pattern dressed up in empathy, a habit of abandoning yourself and calling it compassion. Have you seen your own mask slip under pressure? Because when you do, you'll see the real reason you couldn't walk away. You weren't waiting for them to change. You were waiting for permission to choose yourself. Love isn't supposed to make you flinch. And yet, for many empaths, the only love they recognize is the kind that makes them tense before they speak, anxious after they're heard, and unsure if they'll still be loved tomorrow. Why? Because somewhere deep in their emotional blueprint, pain was labeled as passion, instability as intimacy, and anxiety as connection. They don't fall for peace, they fall for patterns. Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. For empaths, that avoidance often hides in their attraction to emotional chaos. They don't chase love, they chase familiarity. And sometimes, that familiarity is dangerous. Take Caleb, for example, a kind, emotionally intelligent man who always put others before himself. He met Adrian at a charity fundraiser. Adrian was magnetic, smart, confident, a little intense. At first, their connection was electric. Adrian would text Caleb nonstop one day, then go silent for two. He'd praise Caleb's empathy, then mock him for being too sensitive. Caleb felt off balance, but he mistook it for chemistry. The anxiety in his stomach? He thought it was excitement. The nervousness before their dates? He called it butterflies. But what he was really feeling was his nervous system reacting to emotional unpredictability, something that long ago had been wired into his definition of love. You see, Caleb grew up in a house where affection had conditions. His father praised him only when he succeeded. His mother withheld warmth when she was overwhelmed. Love was never steady, it was earned and often withheld. So as an adult, when someone made him feel uncertain, he didn't run. He leaned in. His shadow, the part Jung described as the unconscious aspect of the personality which the conscious ego does not identify with, was still trying to rewrite an old story. Caleb wasn't just loving Adrian. He was unconsciously reenacting his childhood, hoping for a different ending, hoping that if he just stayed calm, kind, and understanding long enough, the chaos would stop and he would finally be enough. But here's the painful truth. Healing doesn't happen through repetition. It happens through revelation. What Caleb needed wasn't another emotional roller coaster. He needed to confront why he couldn't breathe in stillness, why peaceful love felt boring, why someone who offered him calm felt less alive than someone who triggered his survival instincts. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes vital. It's the process of integrating your unconscious wounds so you can finally live as a whole self, not just a fractured one reacting to the past. Adrian never changed. But one night, after another argument masked as a deep conversation, Caleb sat alone in his apartment and felt something shift. Not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. The realization that he had never felt safe in this relationship, not once. He remembered how often he edited his words, softened his tone, and made excuses for Adrian's dismissiveness. And in that moment, the illusion cracked. This wasn't love. This was fear with a flattering disguise. The kind that walks into your life wearing your trauma's cologne. Jung taught that healing is not found in comfort. It's found in confrontation. The confrontation of our own shadows. The realization that what we call chemistry may sometimes be our unresolved pain recognizing itself in another. And until we bring those patterns into the light, we will keep calling danger destiny and chaos closeness. Because when love feels dangerous, it's not love. It's the shadow calling you back to a wound you haven't healed. The people who made you feel unsafe didn't challenge you. They conditioned you to believe peace was a luxury you had to sacrifice for connection. And now, you don't trust peace. You only trust patterns. But the familiar isn't always the faithful. Sometimes, it's just the wound wearing a mask. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one who reminds us of ourselves. Carl Jung once said, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." To an empath, this isn't just poetic, it's prophetic. It explains why you stayed when every sign told you to go. Why you forgave when it hurt. Why you saw beauty in someone who kept cutting you with it. It wasn't naivety. It was projection. You weren't just seeing them. You were seeing a hidden part of you reflected back. Imagine this. You have a friend named Lena. Kind, deeply intuitive, the kind of person who always gives people the benefit of the doubt. She starts dating a man named Jonah, quiet, guarded, emotionally unavailable. At first, Lena says he's deep, misunderstood. She sees in him a wounded child, someone who's just been hurt too many times. He just needs time, she says. He'll open up. But months go by. Jonah stays distant, cold, dismissive. Still, Lena stays convinced he's healing. What no one sees, not even Lena, is that she's not staying for Jonah. She's staying for a piece of herself she once silenced. The little girl who felt invisible in her childhood home. Jonah mirrors that pain, that distance. And if she can make him love her, then maybe, just maybe, she's finally lovable enough. This is the trap. Jung called it projection, the unconscious transfer of your own traits, wounds, or longings onto another. For empaths, this projection often comes wrapped in kindness. We project our ability to grow onto others who have no intention of changing. We see ourselves in them, not their actual behavior, but their hidden potential the part we hope exists beneath the surface. We say they're just scared, when in truth we're the ones scared of being alone, of being unloved, of facing the silence once we stop trying. There's a tragic irony here. You think you're staying to save them, but you're really staying to save a wounded version of you. The version who still thinks love is something that must be earned through suffering. So when someone with cold eyes and a closed heart walks into your life, you mistake the discomfort for destiny. You think, this is my chance to rewrite the ending. But they don't want the ending rewritten. They want your loyalty, not your healing. And you mistake their resistance for depth, their inconsistency for mystery, their coldness for trauma that you're meant to fix. Jung warned us, your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. But projection keeps us asleep. It lets us dream of the relationship that could be, while ignoring the one that is. You imagine their love blooming one day. You imagine the apology that never comes. You imagine being finally chosen by someone who keeps you guessing. But you're not chasing them. You're chasing a mirror. Let's return to Lena. Eventually, she finds herself crying in her car, wondering why she feels so drained, so invisible. She finally confesses, I don't think he ever saw me. And that's the twist. She's right. Jonah never saw her. But more than that, she never saw him. She only saw the part of herself she hoped he could heal. And when that part went unmet, unreturned, unloved, she finally realized, I was never trying to save him. I was trying to save the version of me who thought this was the only kind of love I'd ever get. That's the danger of projection. It blinds you to reality with a fantasy of healing. You become the therapist, the fixer, the emotional translator, never the partner. And by the time you see the truth, your spirit is exhausted. Not from loving too much, but from carrying both halves of a relationship that was never reciprocal to begin with. So ask yourself, is the person in front of you really who they are, or are they just the echo of someone you're still trying to rescue? You don't love the person, you love the possibility of being chosen by what once rejected you. They didn't fall in love with who was in front of them. They fell in love with who that person might become if only they stayed long enough to help. That's the cruel paradox of the empath. They don't attach to reality. They attach to possibility. The kind of love that lives in the future tense. The fantasy of what could be slowly starts to replace the pain of what is. Carl Jung warned us, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And in this context, the empath avoids the suffering of abandonment by clinging to the illusion of growth just around the corner, just after the next outburst, just after one more chance. Let's talk about Maya. She worked with a man named Levi, brilliant, withdrawn, emotionally inconsistent. One day, he'd show warmth, curiosity, even vulnerability. The next, he'd go silent, withdrawn into his mood. Colleagues kept their distance, but Maya saw something deeper. He's just guarded, she'd say. He's been hurt. She brought him coffee, covered for him during his deadlines, sat with him when he stared blankly at his screen. He never asked, but she gave. Not because he deserved it, but because she believed in who he might become. She imagined a future version of him who would recognize her loyalty, who would thank her, love her, maybe even become her partner. But years passed and Levi didn't change. He took her kindness, but never gave anything back. And when he finally lashed out, calling her too intense, she was shocked, but not surprised. Jung would call this a projection of archetypal energy. The empath isn't just loving a person. They're projecting their own inner healer, their own wounded child, their own desire for transformation onto another. They don't see the person. They see a story. And in that story, their love is powerful enough to awaken someone else's growth. That story is seductive. It lets the empath feel meaningful, needed, even heroic. But it's also a trap, because while they pour energy into someone else's imagined evolution, they abandon their own. This is where shadow work becomes essential. The empath must ask, why am I more comfortable investing in someone's future than honoring my own present? Why do I see neglect as an invitation to fix rather than a warning to leave. Often, the answer lies in early emotional templates, childhood dynamics where love was inconsistent, conditional, or earned through emotional labor. When the nervous system associates care with struggle, safety with silence, and validation with exhaustion, then chaos starts to feel like connection. That's not intuition, it's imprinting. And yet, the empath will call it loyalty. They'll say, I just see the good in people. But Jung taught us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And the most absurd thing an empath can do is believe they must earn the love they freely give. Because that belief turns them into emotional laborers, not lovers. Therapists, not partners. Martyrs, not mirrors. Here's the moment of tragedy. The person they're trying to help grow never asked for transformation. In fact, they often resist it. Because on some level, they know the empath's love is conditional. Not on who they are, but on who they could become. And that's not intimacy. That's manipulation wearing a halo. So what happens next? The empath grows resentful. Not because they gave too much, but because they finally realize it was never mutual. Their love was a monologue disguised as a conversation. Their care was a transaction disguised as compassion. And the saddest part? They knew. Deep down, they knew. But hope is a powerful drug, especially when it sounds like healing. So if you've ever found yourself waiting for someone to become the version of themselves they promised in their best moments, pause. Ask yourself, are you in love with them or with their potential? Because one will free you and the other will drain you. You're not staying because you love them. You're staying because you love who they might be if they ever became as kind to you as you've been to them. There's a moment so quiet, so sudden, that it feels like the air around you changes shape, and in that moment, your entire world tilts. It doesn't arrive with shouting or chaos. It arrives with something much smaller, a forgotten promise, a dismissive tone, a silence that lingers too long. And without warning, the illusion you've been living inside begins to crack. This is the moment Jung spoke of when he said all healing begins with consciousness, because truth never explodes, it whispers. And the whisper is always the same. You were never emotionally safe here. At first, you try to ignore it. You have ignored it before. But this time, something inside you refuses to go back to sleep. You replay memories like scenes from a film, moments where you swallowed your anger, moments where you laughed when you wanted to cry, moments where you sat in the same room with someone but felt utterly alone. You begin noticing the tension in your shoulders, the exhaustion in your voice, the anxiety you learned to call normal. Dramatic irony fills the air now. The person you defended most is the person your soul was trying hardest to escape. Jung believed that the unconscious reveals itself in patterns long before the mind is ready to accept them. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he warned. And now you understand what he meant. The pain is not from the person. It is from the realization that you silenced your own truth for them. That you were loyal to a version of love that never protected you. That you kept shrinking to fit inside a space that was never built to hold your heart. Take the example of Malik, a quiet, thoughtful man who always tried to see the good in everyone. His closest friend, Aaron, had a habit of disappearing whenever Malik needed support, but reappearing when he needed advice, validation, or emotional labor. Malik excused it for years, telling himself, he's just going through things. But one day, Malik heard Aaron say to someone else, Malik is fine. He doesn't need anyone. That sentence, so small, so casually spoken, cut through every justification Malik had built. That was the crack. For years, Malik had been fighting a war no one else saw, trying to earn a place in someone's emotional world who had never tried to enter his. That moment forced Malik to confront a truth he had buried beneath kindness. He was never safe with Aaron. Not emotionally, not energetically, not spiritually. He realized he had been the only one repairing the friendship while Aaron didn't even notice the damage. What Malik thought was loyalty was really self-betrayal wearing the mask of patience. And now the mask was slipping. This is the tragedy of awakening. You see not just what they did, but what you allowed. You see the rehearsed conversations you never dare to voice. You see the boundaries you never drew. You see the person you shaved yourself down to become. And the weight of that truth lands heavy. But it also brings clarity. Jung would say the shadow has finally stepped into the light, the part of you that always sensed danger but was too afraid to speak. And as the illusion collapses, the world feels both sharper and emptier. The truth breaks you first because it shows you everything you lost while trying to keep the peace. But here is the hidden miracle. The same truth that breaks you is the one that rebuilds you. For the first time, you see the situation without fantasy, projection, or hope. You see it as it was, not as you wished it to be. And the moment you stop lying to yourself, something inside you shifts. Something sacred. Something powerful. Because now you can choose. And choice, true choice, is the beginning of freedom. Healing doesn't begin when they apologize. It begins the moment you stop lying to yourself about what this was. What if you were never too much? What if the people who said you were simply weren't enough? This is the fear that stalks empaths in silence. The fear of being too sensitive, too emotional, too intense. It doesn't always shout. It whispers in the hesitation before you speak, in the shrinking of your truth so others don't feel uncomfortable, in the way you scan faces for signs of annoyance after sharing something real. This fear is not born in adulthood. It is planted in childhood, often by emotionally unavailable caregivers who taught you, intentionally or not, that your feelings were inconvenient, that your joy was too loud, that your sadness took up too much space, that your needs should be negotiated, not met. And so, you learned how to shrink. You wrapped your depth in silence. You wore the mask of lightness even when drowning. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to navigate society, the social self that keeps us safe in hostile emotional climates. But the problem with wearing a mask too long is that eventually it wears you. You forget where the mask ends and where you begin. You start believing that your value lies in how little space you take, how easy you are to manage, how little you inconvenience others. Take Sarah, for example. She was the peacemaker at work, the one everyone came to with their problems. Always smiling, always available, always fine. But no one ever asked her how she was. She once cried in her car for 40 minutes after a team meeting, not because anyone was cruel, but because someone interrupted her mid-sentence, and she didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. Not because she was timid, but because she had been taught that raising her voice made her difficult. Her shadow, as Jung would call it, was not rage or ego. It was the part of her that wanted to scream, "I deserve to be heard." But she had buried that part so deep beneath performance and politeness that when it finally surfaced, it came out as burnout, not bravery. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Why? Because accepting yourself means reclaiming the parts others made you ashamed of. It means loving the part of you that feels deeply, even when others roll their eyes. It means respecting the version of you that asks questions no one else dares to ask. Empaths often attract people who are emotionally guarded, people who say things like, "You're too sensitive," or "You read too much into everything." But here's the twist. It's not your sensitivity that threatens them. It's your clarity. Your emotional attunement reveals their numbness. Your openness exposes their walls. And instead of meeting you there, they label you as too much. That label isn't a reflection of you. It's a defense mechanism for them. So what happens? You adjust. You dilute your joy. You water down your truth. You apologize for your emotions. You become someone easy to be around, for people who are never easy to love. But something deeper starts to stir. A slow revolt inside the soul. A quiet rebellion from the shadow. You start to realize that your fear of being too much was never yours to carry. It was projected onto you by people who had no room for emotional depth, because they were terrified of their own. Here lies the great irony. The very thing you were ashamed of, your emotional depth, is your superpower. It is what allows you to connect, to sense, to intuit, to understand. It is what makes you a mirror, a safe space, a sanctuary. Not everyone deserves that. Not everyone can hold that. So when someone says, "You're too much," ask yourself, too much for whom? For the emotionally stunted? For the unhealed? For the ones who demand silence, so they never have to face their noise? Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, required integrating the parts of ourselves we were taught to reject. For empaths, that integration begins with one truth: you were never too much. You were just too real for people addicted to emotional distance. And if that made them squint, maybe it's time you stopped dimming your light for eyes that were never willing to adjust. If they called you too much, it's because they were too little to hold you. Sometimes the most painful prison is the one you don't realize you built. No keys, no chance, just a quiet, invisible fear that kept you from leaving. That's the kind of prison many empaths live in, one that looks like freedom from the outside, but feels like entrapment on the inside. You weren't physically trapped. You weren't forced. You just kept telling yourself, this is what love is supposed to feel like. But deep down, a part of you knew. It wasn't love. It was emotional manipulation dressed up in moments of warmth, strung together just enough to make you doubt your instincts. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." For empaths, that absurdity often looks like staying in places that hurt them, simply because leaving would mean confronting a terrifying truth: they were never truly loved in the first place. That realization can break a person, but it can also set them free. Consider the story of Lena. She was the kind of woman who always smiled in public, always knew what others needed before they said a word. Her partner, Jordan, was distant, affectionate when convenient, cold when it mattered most. He wasn't violent. He wasn't openly cruel. That's what made it harder. Because every time Lena thought about leaving, she'd remember the one night he held her when she cried. The one time he listened. And she'd tell herself, he's just hurting. If I'm patient, he'll change. But he didn't. And slowly, Lena became a ghost in her own life. She stopped painting, stopped laughing, stopped asking for anything, because asking felt like too much. The truth was, Lena wasn't staying for love. She was staying because she feared what would happen if she walked away. She feared being alone. She feared being wrong. She feared that if she left, no one else would ever care. And that fear is what kept her caged, not Jordan. That's what Jung meant by unconscious patterns. These fears are inherited, imprinted, invisible. They don't just live in your mind. They live in your nervous system. They whisper lies that sound like wisdom. Don't speak up. Don't leave. You're lucky someone even wants you. But fear isn't wisdom. It's just a shadow pretending to protect you. And until you name that fear, you'll keep mistaking the cage for comfort. You'll keep adjusting to pain like it's a personality trait. Like Lena, you'll smile through the ache and tell yourself it's noble to stay. And here's the twist. No one locked you in. You walked in willingly. Because that's what trauma conditioning does. It makes self-abandonment feel like love. And the moment you start to see this, the cage begins to vanish. Not because someone set you free, but because you realized it was never locked. There's grief in this awakening. Grief for the years you gave away. Grief for the younger version of you who begged for scraps of affection. Grief for the dreams you shelved just to make someone else feel secure. But in that grief is clarity. And in that clarity is power. Power to walk away without apology. Power to feel joy without guilt. Power to reclaim the parts of you that you once exiled to survive. Because healing isn't always a thunderous breakthrough. Sometimes, it's just the quiet decision to stop explaining your pain to those who caused it. To stop defending the ones who left you bleeding. To stop waiting for a better version of them and start becoming a better version of you. Carl Jung also said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become that person inside a cage, especially one you built to make others more comfortable. You have to dismantle the belief that you owe your peace to those who never protected it. And when you finally step out, when the grief settles and the silence becomes soft instead of sharp, you'll see the truth that was waiting the whole time. You weren't broken. You were just buried. And now, you're coming back to life. You weren't locked in. You were just waiting for permission to walk out. It doesn't start with slamming doors or dramatic exits. It begins quietly, like a voice you barely recognize, whispering from deep within, "This isn't me anymore." That whisper is the beginning of your return, not to who others wanted you to be, but to who you were before you learned to hide your light, before you became an echo of everyone else's expectations. Carl Jung called this sacred journey individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all your parts, especially the ones you once silenced to survive. To understand this return, you have to understand what took you away in the first place. Imagine someone like Lena, empathic to the bone, raised in a household where emotions were either too much or not welcome at all. Her father called her dramatic when she cried, and her mother praised her only when she smiled through the pain. So Lena became the peacemaker. She wore a permanent smile, read the room before she read herself, and built a personality that absorbed everyone else's storms. Her friends loved her for being easygoing. Her boyfriend adored how she never started drama. But inside, Lena was vanishing. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what if who you truly are was never allowed to exist? For the empath, the true self is often buried beneath years of personas. The caretaker, the listener, the forgiver. These identities are not fake. They are fragments of survival. They help you navigate unsafe emotional landscapes. But over time, these masks become cages. You smile through discomfort. You explain away disrespect. You feel exhausted but call it being strong. And then you wonder why you feel so empty when you've done everything right. This is the core of the empath's crisis. Your goodness became your prison. Your compassion became currency in relationships that only survived because you kept paying the emotional bill. The return to self begins the moment you stop apologizing for your truth. Jung believed that healing meant not just fixing what was broken, but integrating what had been denied. That means reclaiming your anger, not as aggression, but as boundary. It means honoring your fear, not as weakness, but as wisdom. It means listening to your intuition, not as overthinking, but as deep knowing. These parts were never flaws. They were messages, your psyche's way of guiding you back home. There's dramatic irony in healing. The more you reclaim, the less others recognize you. Some will say, "You've changed," and they're right, because healing means becoming less palatable to the people who only valued you when you were self-abandoning. You'll start noticing the imbalance, the one-sided conversations, the way you leave gatherings feeling emptier than when you arrived, the silent contracts you signed where love was only given if you stayed small. And you'll start asking questions that terrify the parts of you still clinging to those contracts. What if I don't call them back? What if I stop explaining myself? What if I choose peace over people? It's terrifying, because when you let go of the roles you once played, you risk losing the people who only love the performance. But what you gain is everything. You gain clarity, energy, self-respect. You stop living on emotional breadcrumbs. You stop scanning rooms for danger and start scanning yourself for truth. You stop asking, "Am I enough for them?" and start asking, "Are they enough for me?" And that shift, that's your return. The empath's journey is not about turning cold. It's about learning that love doesn't require self-erasure. That softness without boundaries is not compassion, it's codependency. That your depth, your presence, your truth is not a burden. It's a mirror. And those who can't meet you, they were never meant to stay. You're not here to fix people. You're not here to absorb pain that was never yours to carry. You're here to live with your whole self intact. When you finally come home to yourself, you realize you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong people. There comes a final moment, not loud, not chaotic, but still devastating, when the empath realizes silence is no longer survival. It's self-betrayal. It doesn't arrive during an argument or a tearful breakdown. It arrives in stillness. A family dinner where everyone laughs while you smile through tension. A phone call where your truth catches in your throat, and you hang up feeling smaller than you were before. A glance in the mirror that asks, quietly but firmly, "When will you stop abandoning yourself just to keep the peace?" Carl Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And for years, you did just that. You silenced yourself. You filtered every word. You made your truth easier to digest for people who never once softened their cruelty for your sake. You weren't weak. You were terrified. Terrified of rejection. Terrified of being called dramatic, too sensitive, too much. So you traded your clarity for connection. You whispered your needs in the same rooms where others shouted their demands. But this time is different. This time something clicks. It's not rage. It's not despair. It's a quiet internal rupture, one that says enough. You don't announce your boundaries. You don't deliver a monologue. You simply stop shrinking. You let the silence break. You stop reaching out to those who never met you halfway. You stop explaining yourself to people who never listened. The weight you carried, the one made of compromise, self-doubt, and emotional translation, finally starts to fall off. Let's make it vivid. There was a man named Kalen. Everyone saw him as strong, composed, easygoing. But what they didn't see was how often he kept the peace by swallowing his pain. His brother, Darren, was the loud one, the opinionated one, the one who mocked Kalen's softness as weakness. At dinners, Darren would make jabs. "You're too sensitive." It was just a joke. Kalen laughed along. At birthdays, Darren would forget his gift or show up late, always with a dismissive excuse. Kalen never confronted him. Instead, he internalized it. Maybe I expect too much. Until one night, after their father's funeral, Darren joked that Kalen had cried like a girl during the eulogy. The table went quiet. Everyone looked to Kalen, expecting the usual smile, the deflection, the placating response. But this time, Kalen didn't laugh. He didn't defend. He didn't respond. He stood up, picked up his coat, and left. Not in anger, in clarity. Because in that moment, he finally saw what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Kalen wasn't weak. He was wounded, and his silence was no longer a bomb. It was a betrayal of his true self. He wasn't walking away from Darren. He was walking back to himself. That's what happens when the empath breaks their pattern, not through fury, but through truth. You start reclaiming space that was always yours. You stop rehearsing your feelings just to make them easier for others to swallow. You stop editing your honesty to avoid making others uncomfortable. You speak, maybe softly at first, maybe shakily, but you speak. And this time, your voice doesn't ask for understanding. It simply exists. Proudly, firmly, finally. And that's the moment you never go back. Because now you know what manipulation disguised as love feels like. You know what emotional labor without reciprocity does to your soul. You know what it costs to keep swallowing your truth just to preserve relationships that are already bleeding you dry. And most of all, you know what your peace sounds like when no one is interrupting it. This is not revenge. This is not rebellion. This is remembering. Remembering that your honesty is not a weapon, it's a mirror. And those who flinch at your reflection were never ready to see you fully. But that's not your burden to carry anymore. Because once you've faced your soul, once you've heard your own voice after years of muffling it, you don't go back to whispering. You don't go back to the cage. You don't go back to being someone easy to be around just so others don't have to stretch to meet your truth. This is the turning point. The last dinner where you stay quiet. The last phone call you leave feeling empty. The last time you explain yourself to someone who never tried to understand you. You don't explode. You don't scream. You simply stop shrinking. You stop filtering your truth for people who never filtered their cruelty. You stop apologizing for needing what every human being deserves: respect, presence, safety. Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their soul. But not you. Not anymore. You faced it. You've seen why you stayed, why you begged, why you tolerated what you swore you never would. And now you know. You know what safety feels like. You know how to recognize emotional warmth. You know that you deserve reciprocity. The lesson wasn't about them. It was about you. And now that you've chosen yourself, you'll never forget how it felt to be unsafe. Because once an empath knows their worth, they never stay where silence feels safer than honesty.